It's an honor to be sitting up here with my two colleagues discussing a topic as important as mourning. It's also an honor to be in this room with the other participants in this program who are the members of the master class that is taking place after these lectures each week, and there are 30 religious leaders from around the city participating in it, and I'd like to ask those who are in that master class just to stand so we can see who you are. Yes. I believe that it is the work that will come from this master class that will in fact have the greatest legacy for this city and how we go about mourning the 10th anniversary of 9/11, because it is these clergy who will be on the ground and in the communities where the more sustained discussions take place. Last week we talked about trauma, and just to briefly recap some of the words that I shared with you, I discussed the way in which violence in an individual level or a communal level leaves marks upon the body, the psyche, be it just the way it marks the mind of a person who has undergone an event that is too overwhelming to make sense of, or the way it can structure the story and the body of whole communities who viscerally connect to one another and carry within them that moment of that violence. And I think it's very important when we approach the topic of mourning, we remember the role that the body, that the unconscious mind, and that the space between people that is filled with the viscerality of our connections holds memories and realities that we cannot always put our hands on, but nonetheless compel us deeply. In that context, I talked about many features of traumatic violence, but focused on one in particular, the compulsion to repeat, and the way in which, in that psychic space that is often unconscious, the event of violence can circulate in the mind, in the body, in the community, without a home, without categories to anchor it. And as it circulates, communities and individuals can be caught up time and again in the desire to once again perform in unconscious ways the act of violence. And this is the way violence just gets inside of us, and it takes us over, and we start enacting the very things that are done to us because it feels so familiar, because it has occupied you, quite literally. Then I talked about how in the Christian tradition, theologically, we have this very vexed story that sits at the center of the faith, which is the story of an event of enormous violence. The slow, tortured death of Jesus, the crucifixion. And what we see over time in the way Christians have told that story is it is often told not as a way of disrupting violence, but in the cycle of the compulsion to repeat, so that the story itself becomes the harbinger, the carrier of the violence enacted once again. And that the challenge for Christians in this context is to begin to engage that story in such a way that it interrupts rather than repeats the reality of that violence. And that is where today we come to the topic of mourning, which is a very important dimension of that interruption. The topic of mourning. I stand here in silence because in so many ways to even begin to speak of the place that one moves when one moves into that realm is moving into a place which is so much more than words, precisely because it becomes the performance by which an individual or a community goes down into that space where violence and loss live. That is so much bigger than the words we could possibly use to articulate it. It is often said that of all of the emotions, mourning and grief are the most difficult, because grief is not something that one masters, that one gets on the other side of and then has completed the reality that one is engaged. It is the capacity to manage a loss that never leaves. When we're talking about events of traumatic violence as huge as the events of 9/11, it is very common in this country for us to approach those events, particularly when we're not directly next to them, with the desire to get over them. This is actually something that happens very often with trauma survivors. They are approached by pastors or people with therapeutic intentions and given the goal of working through the trauma so that they can get back to life as it used to be or should be. And as the literature on trauma tells us, that the only way you move through trauma is to move through it and carry it with you into the present. To engage the dimensions of violence that haunt us requires, courage is not the word I want to use for it. It requires the simple and not so simple ability to recognize that one can bear it. And it's only in that moment of bearing it that a future begins to emerge, because once it is born, once it comes out of that space of unarticulated harm and enters the story of our lives, it gets a framework, theologically, religiously, community-wise, that is a space in which we can move consciously and in relation to one another. And this is precisely why, as we come up to the events of the 10th anniversary, religious communities will play a very crucial role, because it is in the rituals of religious communities, at ways that, again, exist below the radar of what we can articulate, that put bodies in motion, in actions of mourning that give us the patterns that work through in our bodies, in my body, in the body of a city, in the body of families. The actions, the gestures that pull that reality into the space of what I think of as redemption. Redemption not as getting over, but redemption as that place where hope flickers, if just for a moment. One final word before I turn it over to Rabbi Vitowski. In the context of thinking about mourning and our desire as a country to not deal with mourning and to have nice little stories we tell about who we are as a nation, we often not only want to, leap over the hard activity of bearing loss that never goes away, but we get afraid also of rage. One of the most, I think, profound psalms is the psalm that is so often spoken in our churches around mourning, which says, "By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and we wept." And here we have this action of laying down and crying. Then it goes on to say, "And we picked up the children of our enemies and smashed their heads against the rocks." If as a community of faith, in so many different iterations, we are afraid of the rage that lives in that space, then we will never even come close to what it means to lie down and weep. And until we are not afraid of that voice that cuts as it lives in violence, the songs of hope simply cannot be sung. From a Christian theological perspective, it's important, I think, to end on the note that in terms of the story of the crucifixion and the God who dwells there, in a tale that is not a simple repetition, what a profound thing it is that in the midst of the crucifixion, and in my mind even more on the day after the crucifixion, when there is no life anywhere, when Jesus has descended into the bowels of the earth, in that place there is no God. And when the place where there is no God is that place where in that moment God most fully is. Thank you.